A young Virginia militia officer named George Washington fired the shots that started a world war. This wasn't the American Revolution, this was the French and Indian War, a brutal struggle between empires that would decide who ruled North America. Over 9 bloody years, British redcoats, French regulars and native warriors clashed from the Ohio Valley to Quebec, in a conflict so vast Europeans called it the 7 Years' War. And its aftermath would spark an even greater rebellion. In the shadowed forests and rugged frontiers of a young continent, the French and Indian War erupted, not merely a clash of empires, but a desperate struggle for the soul of North America. From 1754 to 1763, France and Great Britain waged a brutal, emotional battle across the wilderness, where native alliances, colonial dreams and imperial ambitions collided in blood and fire. This was not just a chapter of the global 7 Years' War, it was the decisive crucible that would determine who would claim dominion over the boundless lands of the New World. Echoes of earlier wars, King William's, Queen Anne's and King George's, haunted every skirmish, every torchlit fort as generations of rivalry boiled to a final, thunderous crescendo. The outcome would not only redraw borders, but ignite the fuse of revolution and reshape the destiny of a continent forever. Dramatic and emotional rewrite, causes of the French and Indian War. Beneath the dense canopy of the Ohio River Valley, a storm was building, one not just of soldiers and muskets but of empires, cultures and destinies. The French and Indian War ignited from a single burning question: whose world would shape the heart of North America? To the British colonists, these wild lands were a promised frontier, secured by centuries-old charters, carved out by pioneers, and sanctified by the sweat of Virginians and Pennsylvanians pushing westward. Yet to the French, whose explorers like La Salle had once sailed down the mighty Mississippi and claimed its veins of land for the crown, this territory was a sacred artery of empire, fortified by trade, native alliances and dreams of continental dominion. For decades, rival claims simmered beneath the surface, as British settlers crept past the Appalachians and French soldiers secured the Great Lakes. Now at last diplomacy had frayed and all the old tensions, of maps drawn in foreign courts, of rivers bearing the ambitions of kings, erupted into war. What began as a struggle for a river valley became a fight for a continent, and for the future of an entire civilization. Dramatic and emotional rewrite. Initial hostilities of the French and Indian War. The spark that would ignite a continent came not with grand declarations, but with quiet defiance and blood in the woods. Though the distant empires of France and Britain had long laid competing claims to the rich Ohio Valley, it was the bold decision of the French Governor-General in 1749 that hurled the region into chaos, dispatching Pierre-Joseph Céloron to tear down British flags and order colonial traders to retreat from what France deemed sacred soil. But trade, ambition, and survival were not so easily uprooted. In 1752, French forces and their native allies struck with fury, burning the British trading post at Pickawillany, seizing or killing every English-speaking trader they could find. The blow was personal, not only to Pennsylvania but to powerful Virginian families, whose hopes and fortunes were now tied to the land. As tension escalated, young George Washington was sent to confront the French at Fort Le Boeuf, a mission that failed but set in motion something greater. When the French seized the nascent British fort at the forks of the Ohio, and Washington, now leading Virginian militia, clashed with French forces at Fort Necessity, killing a French officer, the powder keg exploded. On July 3, 1754, Washington was forced to surrender his sodden, blood-stained fort to superior French and Indian forces. Humiliated, the British retreated, but their resolve hardened. As the colonial flames spread, King George II was reluctantly drawn into the growing inferno, dispatching General Braddock and fleets of warships to wrest control of a land where destiny itself was being rewritten. What began in the tangled frontier would soon engulf the world. Dramatic and emotional rewrite, British response and the war spreads. As the backwoods of Virginia burned with tension and blood, the colonial government sent desperate cries across the Atlantic, to a king reluctant to hear them. George II, weary of war and lulled by a fragile peace just 6 years old, at first turned his back on his struggling subjects, echoing his prime minister's cold decree, "Let Americans fight Americans." But the smoldering frontier would not wait. The raw courage of Virginia's young militias, brave but outmatched, could not hold the line against seasoned French regulars and their indigenous allies. With the storm growing, the crown could no longer deny the thunder. The king relented, summoning General Edward Braddock, a hardened British commander, to lead a force to reclaim Fort Duquesne, the vital gateway to the Ohio Valley. Alongside him, Admiral Edward Boscawen unleashed a fleet into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, determined to choke French reinforcements before they could reach Canada's shores. What began as a colonial dispute had now become a blaze that could not be contained. The French and Indian War had leapt beyond borders, setting the entire continent alight, and the world would soon follow. Dramatic and emotional rewrite. Early French successes and the Acadian exile. The early years of the French and Indian War were drenched in British defeat and colonial despair. From 1755 to 1758, the British cause seemed cursed, its armies shattered, its forts fallen, its frontiers burning. General Braddock, the Empire's great hope, fell in a savage ambush near Fort Duquesne, his soldiers fleeing into the wilderness, bloodied and leaderless. The humiliations mounted. Fort Oswego surrendered in 1756, Fort William Henry in 1757, and Lord Loudoun's grand expedition against Louisbourg collapsed in failure. Even with overwhelming numbers, General Abercrombie's assault on Fort Carillon ended in catastrophe, his men cut down by a vastly outnumbered French force under the brilliant Marquis de Montcalm. Panic rippled through the colonies, homesteads were abandoned, families fled eastward, and the once promising frontier became a graveyard of hopes. Amid this chaos, only one British success glimmered faintly, the capture of Fort Beauséjour in 1755. But victory came with a heavy, haunting cost. The British, fearing betrayal from the Acadian population, French-speaking settlers who refused loyalty to the crown, ordered their forced removal in a grim act of wartime desperation. Torn from their homes in Nova Scotia, thousands were exiled, scattered across distant colonies or sent south to French Louisiana, where their descendants would become the Cajuns. This tragic diaspora, immortalized in Longfellow's Evangeline, added sorrow to a war already soaked in loss. A reminder that behind every fallen fort lay shattered lives and broken dreams. Dramatic and emotional rewrite. British advantages and the turn toward victory. Out of the ashes of defeat rose a man who would change the fate of an empire. William Pitt, a brilliant statesman silenced by politics, now called forth to lead a nation in crisis. As French banners flew over fallen forts and panic gripped the colonies, Pitt saw with piercing clarity that the soul of the war lay in North America. He threw himself into the task with relentless energy, selecting brilliant new commanders like Jeffrey Amherst, James Wolfe and John Forbes, raising fresh regiments, and promising the colonies not just aid but partnership. No detail escaped his eye, no resource was spared. Pitt's vision was matched by British might. The Royal Navy, rising to uncontested dominance, swept French ships from the seas and cut the lifeline between France and Canada, strangling hope along with supplies. The crushing Battle of Quiberon Bay in 1759 shattered France's final fleet, ensuring that no rescue would ever come. Backed by Britain's booming industry and wealth, Pitt unleashed an unstoppable tide, while French Canada, isolated and starving under blockade, withered. It was not only military genius but also economic muscle and naval supremacy that turned the tide. With Pitt at the helm, British victory became inevitable, and the empire began to write a new chapter. One soaked in sacrifice, strategy, and the dream of total dominion. Dramatic and emotional rewrite. The fall of New France and the climax of the war. As the war thundered into its final years, the once-green British and colonial forces emerged hardened by fire, transformed into seasoned warriors of the wilderness. None symbolized this metamorphosis more than Rogers's Rangers, a fearless corps of 600 frontiersmen led by Robert Rogers, whose daring raid struck terror deep into French lines. Yet even their guerrilla heroics were but shadows in a conflict where European tactics met the brutal reality of the American frontier. The balance of power tipped. In 1758, the tide began to turn. General Amherst seized the mighty fortress of Louisbourg, John Bradstreet broke the heart of French supply lines at Fort Frontenac, and Forbes and Bouquet raised the British flag over the long-contested Fort Duquesne. One after another, the French strongholds fell, Niagara, Crown Point, Fort Carillon, until all eyes turned to Quebec. There, on the blood-soaked plains of Abraham in 1759, destiny delivered its cruelest stroke. Generals Wolfe and Montcalm, both valiant, both doomed, led their armies into a battle that would shape a continent, and both fell in the fury. A year later, surrounded and broken, Governor Vaudreuil surrendered Montreal and all of Canada, extinguishing the French flame in North America. The French and Indian War had ended in total British triumph, but it came at a staggering cost of lives, lands, and legacies. The New World had been remade forever. Dramatic and emotional rewrite. The Treaty of Paris and the end of a continent-wide struggle. After years of brutal conflict, shattered armies, and fallen empires, the final blow came not on the battlefield, but at the negotiation table in Paris on February 10, 1763. For France, the dream of a new world empire had collapsed in ruin. Beaten and exhausted, they signed away their vast North American dominion. Canada gone, all lands east of the Mississippi surrendered, except for a small foothold near New Orleans, which was handed to Spain in a desperate gesture of compensation. Spain, too, bowed in defeat, trading Florida for the return of Havana, lost in the war's dying days. And so, an empire that once stretched from the St. Lawrence to the Gulf of Mexico vanished in ink and shame. France, once the master of the interior continent, was erased as a colonial force. In its place stood Great Britain, alone in its supremacy from Hudson Bay to the Florida Keys, its red banners fluttering over a land that had been carved in blood, ambition, and sacrifice. The Treaty of Paris didn't just end a war, it redrew the map of a continent and closed the chapter on French power in the Americas forever. Dramatic and emotional rewrite, colonial reactions and the seeds of rebellion. At first glance, the victory seemed complete. The British Empire stood as the undisputed ruler of North America, with the American colonies its obedient children. Yet beneath the surface something shifted. The triumph of British arms, far from solidifying the bond between colony and crown, began to unravel it. The war, which had cost so much, left the Americans questioning the very foundation of their loyalty. What had once been a lifeline, the connection with Great Britain, now felt like a weight around their necks, a chain of obligations rather than benefits. The threat of French and Native American power had faded, and the colonists, no longer fearing imminent attack, began to question the unquestioned rule of a distant monarchy. Taxation to fund the new territorial empire struck at the heart of their resentment, and soon the streets buzzed with murmurs of rebellion. What began as a struggle for survival turned into a battle for freedom, a fight against the very authority that had once been their protector. The seeds of discontent, sown in the aftermath of victory, would grow into the bitter roots of the American Revolution. The new empire's triumph was in many ways the very thing that set the colonies on a path to revolt. The French and Indian War solved nothing permanently. Britain's victory bred arrogance, France thirsted for revenge, and Native Americans saw their lands threatened. Most ironically, the taxes imposed to pay for this war would drive the colonies to revolution. History isn't neat, it's chains of consequence. What do you think was this war's most significant outcome? The frontier opening? Washington's rise? Let's debate in the comments.